Hi, this is Mrs. Kidman, and in this video, we are going to be talking about factoring. So this is just a quick little introduction to factoring, and it's going to be kind of awesome. So as we're doing this introduction to factoring, I just want to first talk about what is factoring. So factoring is kind of like the opposite of multiplying or distributing. When we have something like this, we've talked about multiplying polynomials a lot. And we kind of touched this in our last video. When we have something like this, we are multiplying it, right? We're trying to combine it into one term. So then we end up multiplying, and I end up with something that ends up looking like this, which is great. This is that standard form. Now, when we want to factor something, what we want to do is instead of multiplying down to this, we want to go the other way. It's the opposite. So I want to go back up here. Now, the way that we do that, we kind of have a couple of general steps that we're going to talk about here when we're factoring. First of all, we have our greatest common factor. The most important thing when we see something that we want to factor, so say for example, I had 3x squared plus 18x plus 24, the very first thing I want to do is I want to take out any greatest common factors. So notice how all of these terms here have a factor or have a multiple of 3, right? 3, 18, 24. So I can actually factor a 3 out of that whole thing. And that leaves me with 6x plus 8. Now this right here is super crucial because by factoring that out, this problem becomes a lot simpler. And we want to be able to factor, if possible, whatever number out that we can. So that's the very first thing that we do when we factor. We want to find the greatest common factor in there and pull it out. Next, we're going to look at this polynomial that we have left over here. And we want to count the number of terms. Depending on how many terms it has, that will affect what we do. So if they have 2 terms, sometimes we get something like this or something like this. Maybe we even might end up with something like this. When there are 2 terms like this, that means that we are going to have to do a special type of factoring, especially if they are squares or cubed roots. That's going to be a special type of factoring, and we're going to talk about that in a later video. If we have 3 terms here, that would be like this problem we have up above, where it's an x squared plus 6x plus 8. What's going to end up happening is we can kind of factor this 3 ways. We either have 2 binomials that we add to each other, we have a binomial that we add and one that we subtract, or we have 2 that have that subtraction sign inside. We're going to end up with one of these 3 outcomes when we have 3 terms. Lastly, when we have 4 terms, what we're going to have to do is we are going to have to factor by grouping. Now that factor by grouping says that I'm going to take that term. So say, for example, I had something like x cubed plus 3x squared plus 2x plus 6. So do you see how I have 4 terms there? Grouping means I'm going to group up those numbers and then factor. And we will talk about that in a later video as well. So when we are factoring, the first thing, get rid of that common factor if it exists. Then look at the polynomial that's left. Count the number of terms. If it's 2 terms, we're going to have special factoring. If it's 3 terms, it's going to be one of these things. If it's 4 terms, we're going to have to group it. Lastly, we want to factor it completely. So I want it to be as simple as possible. Sometimes people will factor it and they won't completely factor things. They'll leave something out. They might end up writing it like this instead of writing it that rest of the way. We can keep factoring this. This has more factoring that can be done, more simplification. So we want to make sure that we factor completely. So as you check out these future videos on our different types of factoring that we're to look at, whether it's 3 terms, whether it's 2 terms being special factoring, or whether it's factoring by grouping, remember, we are going to follow these same rules. Get rid of that greatest common factor if it's there. Count the number of terms. Determine the method that we should use. Lastly, make sure that you factor it completely. I'm so excited to learn about factoring. It's super awesome. So check out the next videos on what factoring is.